Okay, so I'm joined today. I'm joined by Patrick Holden, and I've known Patrick for it must be 10, 12 years. And Patrick is the ex chief executive of the Soil Association, but his career didn't stop there. It kind of started after there. He's going on to do amazing things and has done more to shape thinking on regenerative agriculture than most people I know. Patrick, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction.
Oh,
Um, I'm I'm founder and chief executive of the Sustainable Food Trust, which I started after I left the Soil Association. But I also have a dairy farm, now the longest established organic dairy farm in Wales, where we have 80 Ayrshire dairy cows, whose milk we transform into a raw milk cheddar style cheese. And we've been there 47 years now, which is a long time. And what's interesting about it is that it gives you the opportunity, if you've had a long-term relationship with a piece of land, to see the impact of your practices on outcomes. And although, unfortunately, I wish I had, we haven't really kept very accurate records of all the things that everyone's now interested in measuring, like soil carbon and biodiversity and everything else. We have got some records, and certainly the observation of myself on the outcomes is very positive. And now, of course, things have changed very dramatically in the last few years. And I think just about everyone realizes that we're in the last chance saloon in relation to addressing the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss and all these other existential threats. Of course, the pandemic is probably related to this and adds to the challenge. And it's become clear to me, and I think to more and more people, that whereas taking action used to be about saving the rainforests and the other areas of pristine wilderness, now, because we've cut so much of the pristine areas down, it's really about whether the farms of the world, which more or less straddle all the inhabitable places on planet Earth, could be harnessed in such a way that they address, through changed farming practices, the challenge of reducing greenhouse gas emissions or even sequestering carbon and reversing the biodiversity loss. And my organization, whose mission is to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food systems, is addressing exactly those issues. And we are working obviously with governments, and because of the Brexit event, all the devolved nations and DEFRA are in the process of designing new policy packages, which hopefully will enable farmers to make the necessary changes in their farming practices so that they become carbon stewards and biodiversity stewards. And in relation to the policy design, there is quite a divide of opinion about what the best way ahead actually is. This is a pretty kind of crude way of dividing the two views, but there are people who believe, amongst which is a great hero of mine, Sir David Attenborough, that the best way to sort things out is to farm more intensively on the best agricultural land, thereby leaving as much land as possible to either rewild or kind of manage as a biodiversity reserve. And that would, of course, involve technology. I mean, Sir David referred to the Dutch in his Netflix Extinction film when he was talking about this. And it would also involve continuing use of chemicals, albeit responsibly. Now, that's one camp, the land sparers, I'll call them. And the other camp are the land sharers. And I am a firm member of the land sharing camp. And land sharing essentially involves farming in harmony with nature across the whole of the farmed area and producing as much food as is possible, whilst at the same time preserving and hopefully enhancing the natural capital and the human capital over which farmers have at least some management control. And back to my farm experience, we employ a lot of people because we're making cheese, and that's a 5-person operation. And we'd like to employ more people on the farm, although it's difficult. So we're looking at the Welsh government. And if you're in England, obviously you're looking at DEFRA, and you're wondering, if you're a farmer, will they introduce enough carrots and sticks, which collectively will enable us, me, if I was an English farmer, to shift to farming practices which capture soil carbon, produce sustainable, healthy food, reverse the declines in biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. And the honest answer is, right now, we don't know, but things aren't looking entirely positive, because I suspect that DEFRA's inclination is to adopt a land sparing approach. And they are being encouraged so to do by the no less body than the Climate Change Committee, which is headed up by John Gummer, who I used to know back in the Soil Association days, even going back into the 80s when he was Minister of Agriculture. And unfortunately, which surprises me about John Gummer, his committee and the people that are recommending the changes that need to be made to address climate change are suggesting what they call sustainable intensification on the best land, and thereby making room for more land to go into rewilding of various descriptions. But they are leaving out the core principle, I think, of regenerative agriculture, which is mixed farming. Now, by mixed farming, I mean a farming system which has a fertility building element, probably of clover and grass, in a rotation which might last about 7 years, and then a cash cropping phase, which probably be 3 or 4 years of the 7-year rotation, growing grains or vegetables, potatoes, whatever it is, human food mostly, and then a restorative phase of clover and grass. And of course, during that restorative fertility building phase, the only way that you can produce food from clover and grass is to graze it with a cow or a sheep. Could be a dairy cow in my case, could be a beef cow or a sheep. And because they alone can turn the cellulose material of grassland into food that we can eat. But here's another interesting dimension. More and more people, especially young people, are being told by all the eminent authorities that if you want to be part of the solution in terms of climate change, you need to cut down on meat in general, which is right, but you need to cut down in particular on red meat consumption, because they think, those advocates of plant-based diets wrongly think that if we grow plants instead of animals, it will be better for climate change and more sustainable. Well, I'll try very briefly to explain why that isn't the case. I just mentioned a rotation of 7 years with 50% of it in clover and grass. There aren't probably many other ways, definitely not in the United Kingdom, that we can reverse the declines in soil organic matter that have taken place during my farming lifetime. So structurally, if it's the case that you need a clover grass lay to build the soil fertility, and we need the food that that pasture could produce, then we need to eat the products of that grassland rotational system in order to make the farming system viable. And I think many thousands of farmers in the eastern counties, particularly say in Leicestershire, are thinking, what shall I do to address climate change and reverse biodiversity loss and stay in business? They're looking at mixed farming and they think, I don't think so, because neither DEFRA nor the Climate Change Committee nor the young people of this country believe that that farming system is right for their dietary needs or their issues of addressing climate change. And I think the biggest single problem is that they fail to understand that we really can reverse the declines in soil carbon or maintain the soil carbon, which is in the grassland. It's a little known fact that 2/3 of all the agricultural land in the United Kingdom is currently in pasture. Well, we definitely need to preserve that because that's a huge carbon bank. And if we were to adopt holistic and regenerative grazing practices, we could actually build the soil carbon even in that grassland. But what is beyond dispute is that if you take an arable farm, which is all arable at the moment, there are many of those in the eastern counties, and you put it into a mixed farming system, there will be a carbon gain for up to 20 years and probably more than that. And if you took that to scale, in other words, you farmed the whole of the United Kingdom using regenerative farming practices, it's been estimated that you might be able to take a significant percentage of the CO2 which we've added to the atmosphere during the industrial period back out of the air and put it into the soil. Now, this is incredibly exciting, but what is sad at the moment is that there is a mismatch between policy and the sort of practices which are needed if we're going to restore that lost soil carbon. I think it could change because I think more and more people are getting this stuff, but it needs to change because we've probably only got about 10 years to take the kind of actions I've been describing at a national, not just national, actually, international level, if we're going to use the capacity of farming to reverse all the damage that we've done. So it's an exciting moment in international and UK agricultural history. What we need is informed citizens who know what to eat. And by the way, a sustainable diet probably would be very different from the diet that most people are eating at the moment. Most people at the moment are eating supermarket food, which includes quite a lot of intensively farmed meat. And in the scenario which I've just described, grain production in the UK would decline by 50% because we'd simply be growing less of it and we wouldn't be using chemicals anymore because they're destroying the soil fertility. So we would shift to a farming system which produced much less grain and much more expensive grain. And that would be mainly destined for human consumption, which would mean that there would be no room any longer for all the intensive chicken production, all the intensive pig production, and these mega dairy farms whose cows never get out to grass. And it's another not yet well-known fact that 50% of all the milk that people buy in supermarkets is now produced from these mega dairy herds whose cows never get out to grass. It's only about 25% of the herds, but because these herds are so vast, it's 50% of all the milk. That has to end. So what a sustainable diet would look like, aligned with the productive capacity of regenerative agriculture, would be lots of vegetables, a lot less meat, but actually, paradoxically, possibly even more red meat, grass-fed lamb, grass-fed beef, and mainly grass-fed dairy products, but definitely farmed in that way, not in the intensive way. And the challenge that we have as a consuming public is to know the difference between the sustainable livestock products that we need to eat and those which we absolutely will have to give up. And in that respect, the Sustainable Food Trust has been doing some work for the last 5 years, developing what we hope will be a new international language for measuring farm sustainability, because at the moment there are many confusing certification schemes out there. There's organic, of course, and I had quite a lot to do with designing that scheme. Then there's LEAF, and there's the RSPCA Freedom Foods labels, and then there's Red Tractor, and there are others. And most people are utterly confused about the difference between all those different labels. And if we had, rather like there is on white electrical goods, a kind of simple scoring system where you could work out how sustainable the product was, that would probably make it easier to use your buying power to buy into a sustainable future. So what we've been doing is developing a framework with 10 categories. I'll probably forget some of them: soil, water, emissions, energy and resource use, nutrient cycling, crop and livestock management, social and cultural impacts. That's the kind of fair trade stuff. And giving each of those categories high-level metrics for farmers to measure each year, so that I would have a sustainability audit on my farm. I'd measure the soil carbon, I'd measure the earthworm counts, I'd measure the biodiversity, I'd calculate my emissions. All that would go into a sort of sausage machine and come up with a score. And maybe even my cheese, as well as being organic, because it is organic, it would also have a sustainability score on it. And then you or me, if I was buying the food, could go into wherever it was you were buying the food and make a choice informed by the sustainability score. And more than that, imagine at the COP26, instead of having this really sad debate about chlorinated chicken, the the negotiating team went in and said, look, it's no longer acceptable to have any international trade in unsustainably produced food. What we need is only to permit free trade between nations of food which is truly produced in a sustainable and regenerative way. Anything less than that would either incur a tariff or a tax or be banned altogether. And all that would be possible, rather like a Paris Agreement for food, if we had this new international language for defining and measuring farm sustainability. That's what we're working on now, other projects as well. Better stop now. I think I've outspoken my welcome. So thank you very much for listening to me.
You've got unlimited welcome from me. Patrick, that's absolutely fascinating. And when you were describing the mixed system, my head was thrown straight back to my history lessons. My head was thrown back to the fact that that's what we used to do. That rotation, cash cropping at certain points of the cycle, always every year, but from different parts of the cycle.
That's completely true. When I was a boy, this is a guilty confession now, I spent a year, because my dad was training to be a doctor, on a farm in Hexton, in Hertfordshire. It's between Luton and Hitchin.
Yeah.
And it was a beautiful estate. It was still a mixed farming system. It's about 1957. I spent the whole year collecting birds' eggs, chloroforming butterflies, and just marveling at all the incredible biodiversity which was coexisting with the food production system. So it was even as late as the 60s that most farming in England used to be like that. But it's a bit like the frog in the boiling water, isn't it? You know, most of us aren't old enough to remember that. I can tell you, because I was there witnessing this, that it used to be the case that farming could work in harmony with nature. And I remember particularly the Massey Harris combine going around the field at the back of the house we lived in. It was actually the vicarage in Hexton. Yeah. And everybody in the village worked on the estate, of course, because that's human capital. You know, everybody was employed in agriculture. And there were all these people going around the field, which was ever diminishing bit of wheat, with guns, because there was so much wildlife in there. And they were shooting all these rabbits as they burst out of the, but you just wouldn't get that today, because the truth is that no fault of the farmers, but arable production is an absolute sterile wilderness. You know, I mean, you drive through all these endless arable fields in the east of England, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
It's deeply shocking. And if you want me to, I'll talk to you about Roundup, which is another scandal. And again, most farmers don't realize this, but Roundup is a big, big issue. And I think it'll be banned before long.
Yeah, no, I agree with you entirely. I've got a couple of questions. So one of the things that interests me is the kind of economics of the situation. So how can a farmer how can she or he continue to make a living when they're moving to mix? And you've partly answered that with the conversation around livestock. But equally as importantly, what does this mean for the consumer? If we're to eat less and better, what does that mean in terms of the prices that we pay? How do the economics work here?
Well, the issue about how farmers can make this system pay is critical. The answer is, at the moment, we're getting a kind of social security payment for being farmers. Let's say it's about £100 an acre. As long as you don't break the law, you get this money. It's called the Basic Area Payment, BPS. And Michael Gove, when Brexit happened, said we were going to switch all that money to a new system where we were going to get so-called public money for public goods. And ever since then, the farmers of England, and well, all the four nations, devolved nations and England, have been waiting to see what money they'll get for doing what after the whole new scheme's introduced. And we still don't know, but all the signs are at the moment that there's going to be a lot of so-called stewardship, which is sort of being paid to do things around the edge of your otherwise normal farm. Yeah. And in our opinion, that's completely the wrong approach. Because of what I just said about the 50s, you only need stewardship if you're farming in a way which is hostile to nature. So what we ought to do is to reward farmers for adopting practices across the whole of their farm, which are harmonious with nature. And if we took the £100 an acre we're getting at the moment, just about all of that ought to go into that whole farm sustainable management scheme. And in Wales, that's what they're going to do. But I recently asked a senior official in DEFRA how much of the BPS money was going to go into a whole farm sustainable management scheme. He said 30%. Well, frankly, if there are farmers watching this, listening to this, if you ask them whether £30 an acre would be enough to make them completely change their farming system and go back into mixed farming, they say, of course it isn't, nowhere near enough. So that leads to the second part of your question, the marketplace. How can we harness our buying power? Because we will need to do that. And will food be more expensive? Yes, it will, but it won't really be more expensive because we are already paying for food, this apparently cheap food that we're buying in supermarkets in hidden ways. We produced a report which you can download from our website called The Hidden Costs of UK Food in 2017. And the headline from that report was that for every pound that we spend in food in the supermarkets, there's a hidden pound, which is real cost, which is split 50-50 between damage to the environment and destruction of natural capital like biodiversity and soil and everything, and critically, damage to public health. And all these new diseases, like the massive rise in incidence of cancer, of diabetes, of food intolerances, and of diseases of the immune system, these are all indirectly and in some cases directly linked to changes in farming practice, particularly the impact of farm chemicals on the soil microbiome. Now, if we were to sort out all those things out, yes, the headline price of food would go up, but then we wouldn't be paying for the so-called cheap food in hidden ways through water bills, stripping out the pesticides and the nitrates, through massive NHS treatment costs, and through the emissions where we're going to pass on to our children literally an uninhabitable planet. So let's play the honest, real cost for food.
I love that. I absolutely do love that. And just my final question, actually, we're kind of nudging that way already. In terms of mental and physical well-being, can you see a link between how we farm, what we eat, and our mental and physical well-being? And are you optimistic or pessimistic about that relationship?
Yes, I think there is a direct link. Prince Charles wrote a book a few years ago called Harmony, A New Way of Looking at Our World. And one of the things that he said in that book, which I think is deeply true, is that we've separated ourselves from nature since the Industrial Revolution, arguably kind of since the Enlightenment in some ways. The truth is we are nature. We're not separate from nature. And so the fact that we derive a sense of well-being when we are in nature, when we walk in our gardens or we walk around my farm, in my case, is not surprising because we are part of the ecosystem of the planet at a big scale, a macro scale, or at a micro scale. And when we are in nature, nature feeds us. And I think the capital of the human spirit has been degraded by industrial food, yes, but also the industrialization of nature. And what we do to nature, we do to ourselves. So yes, of course, if we want to replace our consumer society with a new world where we live in harmony with nature and we have a sense of well-being and we derive spiritual food as well as physical food from the countryside, this will be one of the fruits of the agricultural transition that we need to go through.
Love it, brilliant, Patrick. Well, we're going to stop there.